Well, I'll simply ask, what do you consider more improbable? All the amazing coincidences that I pointed out in the Gospels, and mind you, those are only a few. What's more improbable? That all of those coincidences would just happen to be in there as historical facts, or that they were made up, versus the probability that there would be a miracle, as opposed to, for example, a body going missing for some other reason, or not even being missing, for example. Or, for example, people hallucinating. Now, I've made the case very clearly, I think, that the Christians were prone to hallucination. They did it all the time. So the fact that they see Jesus and say that, I think, supports that. Even if miracles occur, for example, they're very unusual. By far, most missing bodies, again, throughout history, are not the result of resurrections, and by far, most appearances of dead people are not resurrections either. That's a fact that Dr. Craig cannot deny and has not denied. Therefore, Craig must prove the evidence for this claim about Jesus is exceptional, enough to prove that none of the usual things happened in this case, and I don't think he's done this. All Craig has are the epistles and the Gospels, but the epistles give us no evidence of anything unnatural. The only evidence they mention for the claims about Jesus, again, are the visions, experienced only by people that the epistles show were hallucinating on a regular basis. And the Gospels fabricate stories quite freely. I think I've made that case. Despite all his attempts to throw arguments against it, I think you can look and see at the arguments that I've made that it's very clear that these are fabricated stories. They're not showing any evident interest in reporting historical fact rather than creating a symbolic mythology, which entails they're not reliable sources of historical data, and you can't establish a theory on on unreliable data. So I don't think Craig has shown the evidence for this claim about Jesus is exceptional, as he would have to do. Therefore, we can only conclude there was nothing unnatural about the Christian claims about Jesus. If his body went missing, it was most likely the way all bodies go missing. But the epistles don't even say his body went missing, and the Gospels can't be trusted on this point. So we can't even say for sure the body went missing. Now, that's the general point for that. Let's cover some of the general things that he has said about this stuff. He says that multiple attestation, well, what he really means are different versions of the story. That actually doesn't increase historicity. We have different versions of the myths of Hercules. That doesn't make the myths of Hercules any more historical. Obviously, each of the gospel authors is changing the story to suit his own particular interests and needs and ideas and creativity. So the fact that there are multiple different versions of the story does not support that there are any sort of sources behind them that they're using, other than each other, of course. And he said earlier that women can only testify to two things in Jewish law. That's completely false. I mean, as I conclusively prove in Not the Impossible Faith, that is absolutely false. The evidence does not support that at all. The evidence actually clearly confirms that the only evidence we have of hostility to women's testimony solely involves a few minor people making arguments about when women's testimony has to be the same as a man's or could be less than a man's. But in reality, all particular court cases could allow female testimony, and I show many examples of that, show the actual discussions where they say women testifying in court was regular on all subjects. It's not abnormal at all, and it's not only those two subjects. He says Daniel was talking about, the book of Daniel is talking about a different particular Messiah. Well, I agree, but of course that particular prophecy in Daniel didn't come true. Ironically, Daniel is interpreting a prophecy of Jeremiah that also didn't come true. So he was reinterpreting Jeremiah. When Daniel's prophecy didn't come true, people were trying to reinvent what Daniel said. And so I think what the Christians were saying when they were looking for scriptural passages to understand what had happened to Jesus and try to understand their end-of-the-world beliefs in the light of Jesus' death, they actually reread Daniel and saw the word Messiah in there. The Messiah will be killed. It says that. So they saw that, and that's where they got the idea for this. Now, he says that the fact that Mark doesn't mention the piercing is relevant. It's not relevant. Mark quotes Psalm 23 verbatim when he's talking about the statements of Jesus. It's not necessary for Mark to use every single element for this to be a marker to his borrowing of certain elements in there. He doesn't have to put every detail in. And we know Jesus is the king. In the previous chapter, he's explicitly called the king, even by the Romans. So he doesn't have to repeat it again in his empty tomb narrative. And he says that the phrase used from the first of the Sabbaths in Psalm 24 is different from the use in Mark. It's not relevantly different. It's different in the sense that it's in a different grammatical case. It's not relevant to what we're talking about here. It's a clear borrowing adapted to the particular grammatical structure that Mark has. So I'll reiterate my final point here, is that the Gospels are full of obvious symbolic fiction. I think I've made the case for that. You can decide for yourselves. And I'll have a lot more evidence for this in forthcoming books. But if we discount the Gospels as unreliable, all we have left are the epistles, and all the epistles show are a bunch of hallucinating cultists, essentially, who saw visions of a resurrected Jesus telling them he had risen from the dead. That's all the evidence we have, and that's not enough to establish that Jesus had actually risen from the dead.